The door shook under 3 hard knocks, and Eleanor's hands froze over the mending in her lap. Margaret's voice cut through the house before anyone could rise. "Do not move. It is nothing. No one ever comes for this house, and no one ever will." Eleanor had heard those words so many times that she almost believed them. She was 17, an orphan taken in out of duty rather than love, and she lived in the small attic room above the kitchen, where the roof sloped so low she had to bend to reach her bed. Her parents had died in a carriage accident 3 winters ago, and since then her mother's sister, Margaret Price, had made it clear that Eleanor's place in the household was a burden, not a blessing. Margaret had 2 daughters of her own, Cassandra and Louisa, both dressed in fine muslin and always seated near the good light of the parlor windows. Eleanor was given the mending, the scrubbing, and the garden, while her cousins were given dancing masters and new ribbons. Margaret often said it plainly, without a flicker of shame. "You are plain, Eleanor. You are poor. No man of consequence will ever look twice at you, so do not waste your hope on foolish dreams." Eleanor had learned not to answer back. She had learned to nod, to lower her eyes, and to disappear into her chores until the sharp words stopped landing, but she had not learned to stop hopping entirely. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet and her cousins were asleep, she would sit by the small attic window with a candle stub and read old letters that had belonged to her mother, letters that spoke of a distant family connection, a title, a name that Margaret dismissed as nonsense whenever it was mentioned. "Fanciful stories," Margaret would scoff. "Your mother always did have her head in the clouds. Look where it got her." Still, Eleanor kept the letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and on quiet nights she let herself wonder if there was more to her story than a life of mending shirts and eating last at the table. The garden was the only place she felt truly free. She grew herbs and small flowers along the back wall, tending them with a care no one in the house seemed to notice or return. It was there, among the lavender and thyme, that she allowed herself to breathe without being watched or judged. She did not dream of rescue exactly. She dreamed of being seen, of someone looking at her and recognizing that she was more than what her aunt had decided she should be. She had no way of knowing that, many miles away, a decision was already being made that would soon carry a stranger's carriage down the very road that passed her aunt's front gate, and that her quiet, hidden hope was about to be tested in a way she never expected. The wheel of the carriage snapped clean in half, and the driver cursed under his breath as the whole frame tilted into the muddy ditch. Eleanor had been sent out on an early errand, carrying eggs to the miller's wife, when she came upon the wreck at the bend in the road. A tall man stood beside the broken wheel, his coat plain but well made, his manner calm despite the trouble. He introduced himself simply as Nathaniel, offering no title, no grand claim, only a tired smile and a request for directions to the nearest inn. Eleanor did not know that the whole town was, at that very hour, preparing for a grand assembly to welcome a duke traveling through the region under a borrowed name, and she certainly did not guess that the stranger before her was that very man. She set down her basket and helped him gather the scattered luggage from the ditch, working without complaint, without flattery, without any of the simpering manners she had seen her cousins practice for weeks in front of their mirrors. Nathaniel noticed this immediately. Most people who recognized wealth in a stranger's coat or boots tried to please him. This young woman did neither. She spoke plainly, asked nothing of him, and even teased him gently when he tried to lift a trunk that was clearly too heavy for one man alone. "You will do yourself an injury," she said, "and then you will need directions to a physician instead of an inn." He laughed, surprised by his own laughter, since he had not laughed freely in weeks of tedious travel and dull obligations. They spoke for nearly half an hour while waiting for a passing farmer to help right the carriage. She told him about the garden she tended, about the herbs that thrived even in poor soil if given enough care, though she said nothing of her aunt, her cousins, or the attic room that waited for her at the end of each day. He told her little of his own life either, only that he was in the area on family business that had proven more complicated than expected. When the carriage was finally set right, he thanked her properly, asked her name, and repeated it once quietly to himself, as though committing it to memory. Eleanor Whitfield. She curtsied, gathered her basket, and walked on toward the miller's house, certain she would never see the stranger again. That evening, while her cousins dressed for the assembly in borrowed jewels and new gloves, Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen, mending a torn hem by candlelight, telling herself firmly that a chance meeting on a muddy road meant nothing at all. She did not allow herself to wonder about his eyes, or the way he had actually listened when she spoke, unlike anyone else in her life. But miles away, in a quiet inn room, Nathaniel sat by the window turning her name over in his mind, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he found that he was not ready to let it go. A single letter, sealed with a crest Eleanor did not recognize, arrived at the house on a gray morning, and Margaret snatched it from the messenger's hand before Eleanor could even step forward. "This is not for you," Margaret said sharply, though the name written across the front was Eleanor's own. She tucked it into her apron and refused to speak of it again, no matter how many times Eleanor asked. From that day forward, Margaret's watchfulness sharpened into something close to fear. She forbade Eleanor from walking to the market alone, insisted she remain within the garden walls, and repeated her warnings with a new, harder edge. "Do not embarrass this family with foolish hopes," she said one evening, gripping Eleanor's wrist tightly enough to leave a mark of worry, if not of harm. "Whatever you imagine happened on that road, forget it. Men like that do not return for girls like you." Eleanor said nothing, though her heart beat faster at the confirmation that something had indeed happened, that the stranger from the road had somehow found his way back into her life through that sealed letter. Unknown to either of them, Nathaniel had spent the days since their meeting piecing together a mystery of his own. His family's old solicitor, a careful man named Edmund Caro, had been searching for years for the last living descendant of a woman long thought lost to the family records, a woman connected to an old dispute over land and title that had never been properly settled. When Nathaniel mentioned, almost in passing, the name of a young woman he had met on a muddy road, Edmund went pale and asked him to repeat it slowly. Whitfield. The name matched precisely, the missing thread in a genealogy that had puzzled the family solicitors for a decade. Nathaniel returned to his rented rooms that night with a strange, unsettled feeling, understanding suddenly that his chance encounter had not been chance at all, but something closer to fate finally catching up with old, unfinished business. He wrote to the house at once, requesting a meeting, unaware that his letter had been intercepted and hidden before Elena ever laid eyes on it. Days passed. Elena grew quieter, watching the road from her attic window each evening, though she told herself she was merely watching the sunset. Margaret grew louder, filling the house with warnings and instructions, certain that whatever storm was approaching could still be stopped if she simply refused to acknowledge it. Cassandra and Louisa, sensing their mother's unusual tension, began to ask questions of their own, though Margaret brushed them aside just as firmly as she brushed aside Elena. The tension in the house grew heavier each day, like the stillness before a summer storm, until finally, on a bright morning that began like any other, the sound of carriage wheels rolled up the lane, and this time, no one inside that house was prepared for who had come to call. The knock this time was different, deep and unhurried, the kind of knock that belonged to someone who never needed to knock twice. Margaret rushed to smooth her hair and check the parlor before opening the door herself, already composing a smile for whatever visitor of standing might be waiting. Her smile faltered the moment she saw the carriage in the lane, polished and crested, with a footman standing rigid at its side. Nathaniel stepped down, dressed now in the manner his true position demanded, and introduced himself properly for the first time, using the full weight of his title. Margaret's composure cracked instantly. She began speaking too quickly, praising her own daughters, mentioning Cassandra's accomplishments and Louisa's fine manners, positioning them both like prizes on display. Nathaniel listened politely for only a moment before asking, calmly and directly, for Elena Whitfield. Margaret hesitated, searching for an excuse, but the true situation showed clearly on her face. "She is occupied with household duties," Margaret said stiffly. "She is not fit to receive guests of your standing." Nathaniel's expression did not change, but his voice grew firmer. "I did not ask whether she was fit to receive me. I asked to see her." Something in his tone left no room for further argument. Margaret sent a maid scrambling toward the garden, and within minutes, Elena appeared at the parlor door, her hands still faintly smudged with soil from the herbs she had been tending, her hair loosely pinned, utterly unprepared for the sight before her. She recognized him at once, the stranger from the muddy road, now standing transformed in her aunt's parlor with a title attached to his name that she could barely comprehend. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel stepped forward and explained, gently but clearly, the discovery his solicitor had made, the old family connection tied to her mother's line, the inheritance dispute that had waited years for resolution, and the letter that had never reached her hands. Margaret's face drained of color as the truth of her interference became plain to everyone in the room. Cassandra and Louisa stood frozen near the window, their earlier confidence replaced by stunned silence. Nathaniel addressed Margaret directly, his tone measured but unmistakably serious, nodding that a young woman of Elena's standing deserved far better treatment than she had received under this roof. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, unable to find words that would repair what had already been exposed. Elena stood quietly amid the commotion, absorbing the fact that the stranger who had listened to her by a broken carriage wheel had not forgotten her, had in fact searched for her with real purpose, and that his reasons were not only about family records and old land disputes. When he finally turned to her again, his voice softened, and he admitted plainly that he had thought of her every day since their meeting on the road, long before he ever knew her name carried any significance beyond her own quiet kindness.